Welcome back. This is week 1, lecture 2, doing history and the problem of the Middle Ages. And this lecture is once again setting up the context, so to speak, as I talked about in the previous lecture. Um, it's important to know and reflect on what we're doing as a basis for understanding what it is that we are actually doing. And the same thing applies to this course, in that if this is a course in the High and Late Middle Ages, what constitutes the High and Late Middle Ages? And it would be easy to just give chronological dates, but how does that work? And that brings us to the problem of periodization. And I'll be talking more about that later in this lecture, because history is divided up into periods. That's how we manage and handle the complexity of it all. And that is part of simply doing history. And so we're going to start with doing history and then go from there. Again, this is for your own understanding. I'm not going to be testing you on this, but just to help approach this course and understand what it is that we are doing. And so, what is history? I begin with that big question because it's might seem to be um, obvious, but it's not. Because when we look at what is history, let's say the obvious answer is history is the past. That's what which has happened. But is it? The past does not exist. And that's the point of departure, in my view, of doing history, is to realize that the past does not exist. And if the past does not exist, what does the term history signify? What are we referring to? And when I say the past does not exist, that's not the same as saying that it never existed. The problem is we cannot examine the past. We can only examine what is extant, what has being, what is here in the present. Now, this gets into the whole philosophy of history, which is not a prerequisite for this course. And again, you won't be examined on it, but just for a general understanding of what we're doing, where we're going with all of this. And so, if we look at history in the Middle Ages do not exist. That which the term Middle Ages signifies did exist at some point, but what exists now are artifacts. Now, I'll be talking more about artifacts shortly. I think I've mentioned them in the last lecture. Sorry about that. But if we look at the term history, we can identify 6 different meanings of the term history. Now, meaning for me is a major issue. I make a big distinction between meaning and signification, what a term signifies, which we can almost say is a lexical meaning. But meaning, as I think I said last time, is always something that we attribute to being and is not inherent in being. If I didn't say that in the previous lecture, I should have. But that is also the principle based on the past does not exist. We attribute meaning to things that exist. And historians focus on things that exist in the present that signify that which no longer exists. So the question then here is history, the term itself. What does it refer to? And it's ambiguous because it can refer to many different things. And here I've listed 6 on this slide. That is what is history, and then the 6 significations of the term history. And here we see, history 1. History signifies the past. That's all that's ever happened, that all that no longer exists. But that means not just big events. It means anything that is no longer. So every individual who has ever existed, all their thoughts, all their actions, all their deeds. And that is impossible to ever know. So when we look at history 1 as the past, even if we could theoretically observe it all, how would we choose to select what it is that we actually look at to describe what it is that we're viewing? Because the past is everything. Just think about it. Could you write your own history of the past? What did you do tomorrow, yesterday? Just even think of it in those terms. Can you write a history, complete, thorough history of yourself yesterday? Do you remember everything you said, everything you thought, everything you felt? No, I'm assuming. So the issue is, an important departure is that in terms of history, in terms of this course, it's not the past that we're looking at. Which brings me into history two, that which has been recorded, the historical record. Now, the problem with the historical record is some things have been recorded, some things have not. That's always been the case, and here by record, I mean some evidence that it was. We talk about history and the prehistoric. The prehistoric is before the development of writing, so approximately 4000 BCE. The historic period begins with the development of writing, when we actually have writings that record the past. But archaeological evidence records the past too. I'll be talking more about that when I get to the issue of artifacts. But the point here is that the historical records, everything that theoretically could exist. Now, we know things have been lost. The famous library at Alexandria, for example, no longer exists. We cannot examine it. We know very little about it because we have other sources that still do exist that refer to it. There are texts that are cited. Cicero's wrote a work called the Hortensius, which was very influential for Augustine of Hippo. That work has disappeared, except in little snippets and fragments. I was working for quite a while on in the Netherlands on the Chronicle of not Jordan, the Chronicle of Helena Fomo, a late 12th, early 13th century Cistercian who wrote this World Chronicle, and much of that text has been lost. Once something is lost, we can no longer analyze it. We can no longer observe it. So history 2 is everything that had been or could have been recorded at some point, which is then a subset of history 1. Everything. But yet, when we look at what still exists, that brings us to history 3. The historical record as it now is. The historical record that we can actually theoretically look at. Now that too is more than we can ever deal with. It's more than we can ever deal with. The actual historical record, which is available to historians. Just as one example, in 1990, way back when, I was one of a number of young American graduate students who was selected for a archival trip tour in Germany. And this is right as the wall was coming down. And we were the first Western group to be allowed into the archives in Potsdam. Now, Potsdam is kind of a suburb of Berlin and what had been East Berlin. So it was in the Eastern Bloc. This is somewhat of a small archive, at least generally speaking, or comparatively speaking. And they brought us down, the archivist brought us down to the magazine, which is where all the documents are. And documents in archives are stored what's called in meters, because they're on shelves and boxes, and one historian can not get through all that many meters in their lifetime of documents, depending on what's actually in the boxes. And that's one of the frustrating things about archives. You may see a box like the letters of Genghis Khan, which, I mean, that's a stupid thing. Someone come up with something better. The letters of well, I'll use a real one. The letters of Adolf Hitler, let's say 1923 to 1944. You might take out that box and, oh, great. And there may be 2 letters in it, one from 1923, one from 1924, or 44. So the problem is, obviously, if that's the kind of thing you get with all these different boxes, you can get through a lot of those more quickly. But the point is in this rather smallish archive, the archivist took us to this room, which was not a big room. It was not a large room. filled with documents. And he said, but more documents, more meters of documents than any one historian could ever possibly get through. And he said, all of the documents here are from the Nazi period. Now, as you would assume, or no, the Nazi period in Germany is one of the most thoroughly combed through, gone through, analyzed periods of history, for obvious reasons. But then he said, all of these documents from the Nazi period, and they have never been looked at. That's astounding. Now, most of them probably would be insignificant. A receipt of Der Fuhrer ordered another 200 million shoelaces or bootlaces. Great, wonderful. But we don't know because they haven't been looked at. At least back in 1990, they had not been looked at. What this means is or points to is that there are more documents, there's more evidence that is part of the extant historical record that is available to historians that historians could ever really manage and deal with and analyze and take into account. As you know, my own area of specialization is the late medieval Augustinian tradition. And I can give you 10 dissertation topics off the top of my head based on works that have really never been studied, but were important for understanding the tradition. So History 3 is the historical record that is still available to us, whether that be documents in archives, books in libraries, manuscripts, etc., or also archaeological evidence, ruins, because if those disappear, they're gone. Our understanding, our ability to try to know what happened in the past is diminished. So that's History 3. And then History 4 is what historians, professional historians, write on the basis of History 3. So this is then what we do, what I do, what all of us historians supposedly do in our own research and writing. Now, not every historian does research and writing, but I won't go into all that for now. But we look at the extant evidence, analyze it, and we say something about it. And so, in that sense, historians create the past because the past does not exist. We don't just make it up. It's not fabrication. It's not historical fiction because it's based on the evidence that exists. Now, often I make the analogy between history and astrophysics. If you are doing astrophysics or cosmology, whatever you want to call it, I don't even know what it is that it would be called, but you're looking at evidence through telescopes that from deep in space. What you see is not what happens now. We have no way of knowing what the universe is like right now. It's looking into the past because of the light years. If it takes 1,000 light years for light to reach Earth, what we see is light from 1,000 years ago. We are looking back in time and then trying to make sense of it. Same thing with history. We are looking at extant evidence that signifies what is no longer. And so when we try to understand and reconstruct and account for that evidence that still exists, just like the astrophysicist has to explain what is this blip of light I saw in the telescope. Where did it come from? How far away is it? What caused it? Historians have to do the same. And it's a very little. So just like we create our understanding of the universe today based on the extant evidence that we have, so we create the past based on the extant evidence. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the past is fiction. It does not mean that history is fiction in any way, shape, or form. We do the best we can based on what is available to us in order to come to an understanding of basically how did things get here. So that's History 4. Now, History 5 is what is taught based on History 4. So it's a subset, so to speak, of History 4. History 4 is a subset of History 3. On we go. But it's also the historical profession as such. So it's the historical profession. We have, our society, it's the American Historical Association, etc. Um, and so it's the how the whole discipline is organized, guided. We have, from the AHA, we have guidelines about what are the best practices for teaching history and things. It's all focused on teaching and writing and history. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not a big fan of the AHA, but that's a whole other issue. But that's kind of what History 5 is. And so, in that sense, this course is part of History 5. It's not actually doing the research and writing on documents, except you will be doing that a little bit to see what it's like in your term paper. But it is me teaching and presenting to you my analysis and understanding of the extant documents that either I've studied or others have studied, and I'm reading what other scholars have come up with, um, to create this period that we designate as the Middle Ages. And then we have the problem of History 6, which is what the common view of history out there. Now, the problem there is that many people, even if they've had a history course in college, which is no longer a requirement, so you can get a college degree with never taking a history course, it's usually equated with History 1. Most people think that, history is what happened, and all we have to do is go out and find it, and then we'll know because the past is past. It doesn't change. So History 4 and History 5 have to kind of fight against History 6. That's where we are here. And the problem, too, is inherent with History 5 because of how we teach it. Now, I'll be talking about fallacies in a second, historical fallacies, but probably the biggest historical fallacy is accepting the description of things as the things themselves. There was no such thing as the Middle Ages. It's an historiographical description created by historians. The same thing for the American Revolution did not exist. Documents that signified major changes in war, and the Independence Declaration of Independence is a document that exists. But the so-called revolution does not, because we could call it something else. If it signified the same thing, it would be still signifying the same thing. We could call it the Great American Rebellion. Still, what happened, quote unquote, doesn't change. But how we label it, how we identify it, how we understand it does. And that's the issue here. How do we label and understand the past? And the fallacy is taking those labels and categories, umbrella terms, as the thing itself. We cannot go looking for the Middle Ages. We cannot go looking for America. America is an idea, it's a concept, it's a construct. It affects how we view things, and how we view America affects how we read and interpret and understand the extant evidence that signify what we call America. So that is a problem. We have to realize there is no such thing as the Middle Ages, or as I'll talk about shortly, the Middle Age. It's a construct, it's an interpretation. And so when we look at this course, we have to realize what it is we're doing. We are analyzing the terms that we use to describe the past, this chronological period that is signified approximately by the years 1000 CE to approximately 1500 CE. Looking at the actual historical record that exists, what historians have said about it, under the category of Europe in the Highlander Middle Ages. Now, that I know is a lot to kind of absorb all at once. I'm actually working on a book, another book called On History, an Introduction. It's a long story. I won't go into the whole history of this work. but I'm getting it into a form that I'm going to be assigning it in the spring semester to the graduate course, the methodology course. I'll be teaching the graduate students methodology, and I'm going to be assigning this book for them. Now, if you're interested, I can happily send you chapters where I go into a lot of this in much more depth. But the point here, in terms of our course, what it is that we're looking at, Europe in the High and Later Middle Ages, is not the same as what is thought of out there in History 6. It's not even the same as what is taught in History 5, even though that's kind of what this course is part of, History 5. But it's based on History 4. And what we really look at is History 4, which is based on History 3, the historical record, because that's the only thing we have available. And the distinction, the discrepancy between History 3 and 4 and then History 1 and 6 is huge. History 2 is theoretical. Now, so that being said, where do we go from here? Now, the next point on this slide, what is history as science and artifacts. And that is what really the whole point of all this is. Artifacts. Artifacts are anything that is made by art. Artefactus, Latin, made by art. And art is anything that is not produced by nature. Anything humans produce is an artifact, is made by humans. Now, the whole point of this is that's what we look at. Now, history, some historians definitely do take into account natural evidence, geography, weather patterns that we can tell, topography, etc. And later in this course, I'll be talking about the Great Northern Famine, which we can tell to a large extent by analyzing tree rings, endocrinology, as it's called, which is a natural piece of evidence that we can analyze. That too is an artifact in that it still exists, even though it's not made by human beings. But that shouldn't, I don't want to go into that distinction and problem there. But the point here is that what we are looking at is the extant evidence. And in that sense, history is scientific. Now, there's been a long debate about whether history is a humanities or a social science, whether it's science or whether it's art. And I'm not going to go into all that right here now because we'd be here for the rest of the semester talking about things like that. I talk more about it in the book on history and introduction. So if you're interested, just let me know. I can send you some of those chapters. The point being is that we can only make statements about the past based on the evidence that exists. And if there's no evidence, we can't make statements about it. We can't claim it's called, the fallacy of an argument from silence. We can't say because there's nothing there, therefore this is what it was. Historians base themselves on evidence, just like quote unquote scientists do. And of course, in Latin, scientia, science, simply means knowledge. Simply means knowledge. We distinguish all these different things. In German, we have the Naturwissenschaften, the natural sciences, and we have the Geisteswissenschaften, the human sciences, the spiritual sciences, the humanities. Both are Wissenschaft is science in German. We've lost that in English. We have science, and we have almost everything else. Science just means knowledge. So to the extent that history is knowledge, whatever that means, and I could talk a lot about that, which I'm not going to right here and now, but to the extent that it is a field of knowledge, a discipline of that which is known about that which no longer is, it's based on the evidence that we have to analyze scientifically. Because if we have a manuscript, we have to analyze that thing, and on we go and on we go. And again, we'll be talking a little bit more about this in the midterm because we're actually looking at a thing, and you're going to be analyzing a thing, which does exist, but it still is an artifact because it's an edition and translation that I've done myself. That again hasn't come out yet, but it will be before too long, before the end of the course. I believe it's supposed to be scheduled for publication in November. Anyway, point being is that's a thing. And so we'll get to see what history is really like, what historians do based on your term paper. But here, in terms of presenting you with this course and the lectures, I'm giving you interpretations, even though they are based on artifacts. And historians debate all the time, just like scientists debate all the time. There are some things that can be proven that are certain to be stupid to debate. Others not. Same thing with history. So there is a foundational aspect of history and the doing of history that is history of science. And yet, if we only have history of science, we don't really get to the meaning. And this is what it's all about in some ways, is history is art, story, and representation. Because it's like, okay, great, this is a manuscript for your term paper. This is my edition of a text that Giles of Rome wrote based on his lectures. Different manuscripts. We don't have Giles's own copy. We have copies of copies. We have witnesses' manuscripts that are seemingly pretty close to Giles's own text that he prepared. So it's a recreation. And then a translation even makes it worse because it's one step removed from that. So it's an attempt to reconstruct something that doesn't exist. That's where the art comes in, because if we just say, oh, here are the different manuscripts, this is what they say. The art is in, what does it mean? What was Giles getting at? That becomes the art. And if we try to make the art scientific, we fail. But if we don't base the art on science, we fail too, because then it's just speculation. I have their representation. There's a whole, let's almost say, school of philosophy of history that is based on history is simply representation. And on one level, say, yes, it's representation, but it's representation of something. And that's where the science comes in. Whatever it is that we are basing our representations on, that needs to be analyzed scientifically, whether it's a manuscript, a building, a ruin, or whatever. Now, that kind of wraps that up in terms of history as art and history as science. And we have to then be aware of the fallacies. And the major one I've already mentioned, the fallacy of accepting the categories in our descriptions of interpretations of that which exists, the evidence, which signify that which no longer exists, the past, as a thing itself. And then we go looking for that thing. And in doing so, I have what is history. What we're trying to get at is the Middle Ages. How do we identify it? How did they understand themselves? What was their sense of their own identity? Did they say, yes, we are medieval people? We are medieval people. No. As you'll see, I argue in chapters that you're assigned for next week's reading, Rome never fell. Never like all of a sudden someone opened up a paper and said, Rome has fallen. Doesn't happen. Not happen. So we can look for things, but then it's that difficulty of knowing, is this description, interpretation, representation, or is this something that is based on actual evidence? And only if it is something that is based on evidence can we make statements about that which no longer exists. And with the identity issue, if we want to know, is it what we think of ourselves, what we think of those people in the past, or are we trying to get at what they thought of themselves? I mean, the point of my edition of Giles of Rome in translation is to try to have some insight into how did Giles, who dies in 1316, who wrote this in around 12, well, debated, you'll see around 1275, 76, how did he understand himself and what it was that he was doing? And in doing this analysis and asking these questions, where we're really behind that is, how did we get to be here? What is our identity? What is our selves? Who are we? Because if the past doesn't exist, who are we? And I said, think about it. Can you write a history of yourself yesterday. I thought, no, you can't write not a complete one. What about a history of yourself 5 years ago? No, even less. It's memory, and memory is identity. Because if we lost our memory, could we even answer the question, who am I? No. Can we even answer it, that question, if we haven't lost our memory? I say absolutely not, but that gets into another issue. So we study history as a way of understanding ourselves, but not as ourselves, but as we relate to all that has come before, that which no longer exists, including our younger selves, or earlier selves, because it's a question. And that brings me then to the question, the inherent question of time and the problem of periodization, which I've finally gotten to the next slide. I said yesterday no longer exists. It does in our memory. You can't show me yesterday. You can remember yesterday, but memory is always in the present, even if it is of the past. I cannot remember remembering yesterday. I can only remember remembering today. So if yesterday is no longer here, it's gone. All we have is the present, because the future doesn't exist. And this is Augustine's analysis. The future doesn't exist yet. We can't say, tomorrow. What's tomorrow going to be? I don't know. It doesn't yet exist. The past no longer exists, so what's the present? The present is now. But how long is now? Now can be infinitely divided between future and past. Or, as Augustine said, Augustine, I say the same thing. The future flowing into the past through the present. Time is a continuum, and it's a philosophical problem, because where does it start and